All right, what's going on, fellas, man? Throughout my whole life, obviously, I've had a different way of seeing the world, being able to experience the world and travel through it, and kind of seeing how the world works for my own instead of just listening to the media try to tell a story when truly they're just trying to keep eyeballs on the screen. So, it's always been said that for Africa to develop, it had to look within. And I finally think I got a pretty good understanding of that versus what I used to think and how what I used to think actually influences the way that I see it now. But now it's just being exposed. So let's take a look at this video real quick so we can kind of get a visual perspective of what exactly I'm talking about, and then we'll talk about it here in just a moment.
Africa develops its industry like South Korea did, a country that was as poor as Mozambique 60 years ago. If tomorrow it starts making cars, if tomorrow it starts refining its oil, if tomorrow it starts doing agriculture and transforming its agricultural products, it will no longer buy our imports. And so we are not interested in that situation. We are not interested. So the will of the rich countries. We're talking about geopolitics today. Everywhere we see, there is clearly no interest in these countries developing. These less developed. There was this idea, actually in people's minds, that you develop a country with entrepreneurs. It's an important part, but it's not the main part. An industry is needed, a heavy industry. These countries export oil, export cocoa, export raw materials, but these raw materials they export are often processed in other countries. And processing is what creates jobs.
Quand vous avez une compagnie étrangère qui s'installe, je prends toujours l'exemple moi, du Congo, Brazzaville, que je connais bien.
When you have a foreign company setting up, I always take the example of Congo-Brazzaville, which I know well. Congo-Brazzaville, over 90%, only exports oil. This oil is produced by whom? Exploited by whom? By mostly private companies. 60% total, 30% ENI. The Italian, 90% of the company. Then you have a few companies here and there, private ones. The public Congolese oil company is unable to do drilling. It is unable to exploit all of its oil. It collects part of the money, but it is unable to exploit it. So all the knowledge on production, on reserves, all the quantities, production volumes are decided by the private company, which does not depend on the country. So that's the first thing. There is a real asymmetry of information between the state and the company. The prices of their goods, 90% of exports, therefore oil, the price is not determined by Congo. It is determined by the financial markets. So, when there are tense geopolitical situations like now, prices go up, it benefits them.
Et l'État congolais rachète de l'essence à ces pays-là. Donc la réalité, c'est qu'il faudrait qu'il y ait une industrie qui puisse transformer.
When the price is zero, as in the COVID period, nothing comes in. Nothing comes in. So we can see that there is a very strong dependence. And then this product is exported, processed in France or elsewhere. And the Congolese state buys gasoline back from these countries. So the reality is that there should be an industry that could transform this production on the spot. And it is this one that would create jobs, refineries, distribution, etc. But to have that, what is needed? Funding is needed to finance heavy industry. It's not with €1 of microcredit that you're going to finance heavy industry. And this funding, if the banks don't want to lend it, who will lend it? It's China, but China is a country. It will lend it under certain conditions. Conditions sometimes on access to raw materials or more advantageous sharing of production for them. And so it does not allow them to be completely independent. And it must be kept in mind that rich countries have developed in a world where they created conditions that were favorable to them. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, is an organization that has favored rich countries much more than poor countries.
Pas à lever de l'argent.
Quels seraient les...
Ce que je veux ajouter, excuse-moi, je te coupe.
The financial system, with mostly European and American banks, the rich countries. And so rich countries raise huge funds to carry out their projects, while poor countries to carry out projects we know. That is to say, to do things we know, refineries, food, agricultural industries, and informal economy. They do not respect the rules. They are corrupt. Some even went further by saying that they are a bit lazy. It has always been a bit like that. And we found the same kind of debate when there was the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, where we called the southern countries pig. They were called Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. They were called the pig. They were said to be lazy, that they were in the informal, that they were not like the Germans and the French. This debate already existed with African countries. They don't work, they are lazy. They don't have good training, they are corrupt. Very well, that's what we said. If tomorrow I were given the reins of Congo Brazzaville, and I was told what the formula is in the current conditions to get it out of underdevelopment and make the economy take off, it would be extremely complicated, and I would tell you that I don't have the solution. Because it's a country, in fact, that does not have control over development at all. Because it does not have access to financing, as I said. Because it does not control the main good it produces. Because it does not control the volume and the price. And so developing a country under these conditions is extremely difficult. So corruption is actually a collateral effect. The real problem is the World Trade Organization and the financial system as it was created. Would you say that there has been a stranglehold by the northern countries? I'll explain, for example. We are looking for what the exit routes are, and especially by whom. Because you may have the preconceived idea of yes, the northern countries are going to help the southern countries again. But in fact, it is because there is a stranglehold and also an enrichment of the northern countries thanks to and by the southern countries. For example, Zambia just had extra time to pay back, but the debt was not written off or reduced, etc. There are also negotiations on the next contributions of rich countries for the upcoming 3-year period, which will soon begin and should end in December 2024. There are also many solutions put forward by the IMF, which are considered as not enough actually. Which way now do you think should be oriented towards? So it is exactly what you said. That is to say that in reality, Africa buys a lot of imports from Europe, and also mainly from France. And we buy a lot of things we need and don't produce, including oil and raw materials. So Western countries are not interested in Africa falling. Because if it goes very badly, if there is not a situation at least stable, what happens? We risk having fewer raw materials that we need, and in exchange, we risk selling them fewer things. So we have to maintain Africa in an intermediate situation, so that it is rich enough to buy our goods and stable enough for us to buy the goods we need, those we really need, energy and raw materials. But no one is interested in Africa developing too much. Because if it develops tomorrow, let's imagine Africa develops its industry like South Korea did, a country that was as poor as Mozambique 6 years ago. If tomorrow it starts making cars, if tomorrow it starts refining its oil, if tomorrow it starts doing agriculture and transforming its agricultural products, it will no longer buy our imports. And so we are not interested in that situation. We are not interested. So the will of the rich countries. We are doing geopolitics today. Everywhere, we can clearly see that there is no interest in these countries developing, these LDCs. Now, if I were in the place of Africans, it is very difficult. That is to say, for me, the first thing I would do is I would be much more aggressive in negotiation. Because if you don't have financing, then you can hold grand speeches. It's always nice. But once you get to the concrete, what is Africa today concretely? As it does not have access to financing, as it does not control the goods it produces, in volumes as in prices, it is trying today, for there to be activity, to attract as much foreign direct investment as possible, by creating free zones where very little tax is paid, saying that this is the only way we have to restart the economy. Which does not allow it either to develop its industry, because the industry that would come is much more powerful and much more established than the one that would develop and would be a nascent industry. So the first thing I would do in this situation, which is an extremely complicated situation, I would seek to be much more aggressive in the production shares. That is to say, when a foreign company comes, you have to impose things on it. The Gulf countries, Qatar, the Emirates at their time, when you came to settle with them for anything, you had to give a big part, more than 50%, to a local native, a local resident of the investment. It was mandatory. The WTO did everything to knock this out, but some countries held firm, except when they really needed it. They make exceptions at the Ministry of Economy.
So as I said, it's always been said that for Africa to develop, it truly has to look within. All the resources are actually available on the continent, but the African countries themselves cannot fully exploit the raw materials. So the raw materials generally are dug up out of the ground, sold to the West at a discount, by the way.
French companies that were mining the uranium were paying the government 80 cents a kilo for the uranium, and then turning around and selling the uranium to the rest of the world at 200 euros a kilo. So that one move from the Nigerian government to say we are now going to take ownership of our own uranium, they went from realizing about $1 billion in uranium resources to over 300 billion a year. Do you realize what I'm talking about? No
Huge.
amount of
Huge.
NGO could bring that kind of money.
In return for maybe military aid or weapons or whatever it may be, depends on the country where the materials are coming from, for what, that exchange is. And in return, all the processing for these raw materials are actually done in the Western countries. So whether it's in Europe, in America, China, Australia, whatever it may be, this is where the processing is taking place, which means that's where the bigger jobs are, the higher paying jobs. And the development, of course, no coincidence, is also in those countries. So this is one of those things that Africa, of course, has to be able to do to fully develop, is exploit its own raw materials. But the fact of the matter is that now all of this is being exposed publicly. Now, people are not hiding these facts anymore. To be fair, though, people were never really hiding the facts. It's just you had to go to sources that most people, in all honesty, didn't care to go see, whether that had to be from the World Bank or from governmental documents and things of that nature that were made public, but most people would never read anyway. So it's not like it's not known. It's just hidden in a sense that most people would never bother to look out for. Just kind of like how so many truths are hidden in books, but people will never just read the book just to find out what they need to know. So I've always definitely thought this way, that Africa is being exploited, which once again is not a secret, but being exploited in a way that it can never fully develop itself. And that the West is also doing everything that they can to make sure that this is always the situation, because Africa being fully developed is just not good for the world, not for the rich countries anyway. When I was younger, of course, it was more or less a personal belief. I kind of needed more proof behind it and something substantial enough that more people could relate to it and find this information a lot easier than, like I said, going to read documents from the World Bank. Having the ability to travel the world a little bit, seeing the world through my own lenses, also has showed me a lot of dependence on the world for African resources, especially in the tech age. All the technology that we are building in Asia, the US, whatever it may be, all these raw materials are coming from the African continent. So most of these loans to these African continents are coming from the West and from China, and generally they're traps for these African continents, meaning you might get a loan for something, but the loan is only going to benefit the country that gave you this loan. And here's a quick example. Uganda in 2015 was given a $207 million loan from China. This loan could not be paid back in the loan terms that were agreed upon. Now China has taken ownership of Uganda's international airport. Sounds crazy. Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni even came out and said, he tried to renegotiate the terms of the deal and stated that there were toxic clauses in the deal. Needless to say, the negotiations were all declined. And this is a very common story in Africa. Many situations like this happen. This is not unique at all. And it's just not a hidden truth anymore. The world is opening their eyes. Social media is exposing some things, but misinformation is still what's dominant in social media. And that's the issue. Even this professor is coming out and talking about why Africa should not be allowed to develop openly, and now people are seeing it for themselves. If it were fully developed, the world would be in serious trouble, because then why would Africans buy exports from the West? Why would they need the West to produce their oil? Why would they need the West to produce a lot of products that are coming from the raw materials, which come from the African continent? Africa is very rich in resources, probably the richest in the world in resources, or one of. Obviously oil-rich countries will always be rich in resources as well, but its dependence on the West makes it very poor. So what if Africa was fully developed? It could become a superpower maybe, like the West and China. Global trade would definitely be impacted. More people would actually know about this situation in Africa as well. What if Africa told its own stories instead of letting other countries tell its stories for it.
Images that they're showing of Africa is historical images. This is way before civilization. This is when they were still, battling with spears, like times of Shaka Zulu. No, I'm serious. But then when you look at the US, they're showing Superman, Batman, Where is our Superman? Where is our, Shaka Zulu should be a superhero today. Really? So we have to tell our own stories. I mean, even Jesus is white. And you believe it. But it's okay, because how you were framed, if you taught something from the day you were born, and your mother taught you that, your father taught you that, it's real. You never look at your mom and your dad as liars. But their mother and father taught them the same thing, because that's the kind of history that's put out for them to believe. Our history books in the US is all white American history, culture that's been borrowed from other nations.
Most people in the West do not actually know what is keeping African countries poor financially. They don't really understand the systematic system that was built just to make sure that this is exactly what happens. African countries, what if they sent more of their youth out to explore the resources, just like the Arab countries and the Asian countries do? But when they come back, will they have the finances available like those countries to exploit those resources afterwards? This is another issue, because the funds, for the most part, that these countries have is tied down in loans that are not benefiting them. So they cannot fully develop, and they have a very close eye on them to make sure they do not fully develop. Our leadership is kind of older, for the most part, on the continent, and they're run by the West for the most part. They're influenced by the West. So we don't really have the opportunity to think outside the box and to think about what the future has to hold instead of just for today, or what's in their own pockets to take benefit of that in return for the West to benefit and make sure these countries do not develop. So long story short, European colonization has a profound and lasting negative impact on this. Exploiting resources, disrupting traditional social structures, hindering the development of local industries. The focus of what's extracting resources for European and Western benefit, and not on building sustainable African economies. All of this is happening. While not the sole factor, internal conflicts and the tribal divisions also have sometimes hindered formations of strong unity. Unified states is just not happening for this very reason. Hampered development efforts also not happening because of internal conflicts on the continent. I mean, you guys see the current M23 invasion of Congo. Once again, it's not a secret. Many African nations have faced challenges with political instability, the corruption. People talk about it. They don't fully understand it, but they do talk about it. The destruction of capital. Obviously, we've seen that happen, especially in Zambia. Have you ever looked at their currency recently? Creating an environment that discourages investment and economic growth. This is another thing. In America, money can pop out of nowhere because of investments. Valuations for companies. You can go get $1 million investment with a valuation of $100 million. This is just an example. And poof, currency is, money just is created out of nothing. It happens. So many African countries are heavily reliant on the exports of their raw materials, making them vulnerable to global price fluctuations. And by the way, of course, these resources are sold at a discount, but it will always limit the diversification that these African countries can have. Let me know what you guys think below with all of this coming out and how you're seeing it now. Maybe your perspective has changed. I'm actually curious to know. But thank you very much, guys, for watching, man. Peace out, y'all. Thank you very much for your time today, guys. Definitely like and subscribe, and we will have much more coming for you. Have a good one.